Hello friends, welcome back to another episode, and in this episode I'm going to talk about on TypeScript. This is a very beginners friendly tutorial, and in this video we're going to create book service API using Node.js, and of course we'll select TypeScript as a programming language. So if you're a developer using JavaScript for your development, let's say you're a UI5 developer or CAP Node.js developer, recommendation is you should start using TypeScript as your programming language because it gives immense benefits. JavaScript doesn't provide any out-of-the-box type validation. I'm declaring a variable called person name, and if I hover on this variable, it shows the type as any. That means at runtime, this variable can going to accept any sort of input values. Let's put some default value as Somnath, and now if I check the type, it does a type inference and showing the type becomes string based upon the value that I'm going to assign. Now the problem is the same variable, if I assign a value as 10, still it doesn't complain, though the type is still showing a string. Here is what TypeScript is the game changer. You can right click on that and switch from JS to TS, and you see TypeScript starts complaining. It's saying that number is not assignable to type string. This is what the main purpose of using TypeScript. During development time itself, you can ensure that your program is not going to break on runtime based upon invalid inputs. Lot of words, let's get to the coding and build our super simple and awesome book service API. So let's get started. We'll start our data modeling first, creating a book model which will having the book entity with different properties. Followed by I'll create a book service that will contain the different API operations. Next, we'll go to the express layer and I'll create a controller called book controller, and that will actually use the express capabilities and pass the different requests to this service API. It will also consume API response utility class to format the API response. Next, we'll get into the book router, which will just enable the different routing to reach the different entities. And at the end, we'll end up with creating this express app, which will abstract all the underlined complex operations. And this will be the final API to test. And we'll be using Postman to test our application. And enter application, as I said, I'll be using TypeScript to design it. So let's get into the coding. So to run the command npm init followed by --y, we'll create our package.json. Next, to start with our TypeScript, we have to install npm install TypeScript. You can install it as a dev dependency because TypeScript is not for the productive purpose, only for the development time we'll use it. Or you can also install it globally, so that across any project you can use it. I have already installed it globally, so I'm not reinstalling it. So I'll use the command tsc or TypeScript compile followed by --init. It will create a configuration file called tsconfig. As you can see, it has a lot of different default values set up already. We'll just change a couple of things. First, we'll change the root directory to source, and we'll also change to out directory as this, keeping everything as it is. So let's save the file, and our tsconfig and package.json, these two files got created. So let's create our different folders and files as a development artifacts. With the interest of time, I have already created the different artifacts, starting with the index.ts, followed by the utilities as API response.ts. I have created the service file called book service. We have the routers called book routers. The model is called book models, and finally the controller is the book controller. So let's start our development all the way from the model definition. To create an interface first, I'll create one interface called book model. Let's having certain properties called id as string, title, let's put it string as well, author is also a string, and finally let's say the year of publish as a number. So this is the interface which I'm exporting out of this data model. Name is book model. We'll create one more type that also should export called new book. We'll be using one TypeScript utility called omit, okay? And I have to put two things. The reference is book model, which is our interface. And let's say I want to omit this ID as a property. So you can type like within a quotation ID. So that way, if you hover it, it doesn't show ID as a part of this new book. Save the changes. Let's go to the next stage called our book service. let's import this model called book model. So two things we can import out of. One is the book model, and second thing is our new book. Okay, so these two currently we have not used it. Let's create a class called book service, and this class we can export for our usage in controller. So to start with, let's use the syntax called private. We'll create a book as a variable, and I'll say that the type is book model but of type array. And let's put a default value or initial value as an empty array, because this will contain all our books. Let's create a public function called get all books, and its implementation is missing, so we'll implement to get all the books. So we'll basically return what? We'll return the array of whatever the books that this particular property contains. We'll use this dot book. So as a return, we can use as a book model of type array. So that way my get function will be able to get all the books as an array. That is the return type definition for the get all books function. So next, do one more public function called get book by id. So obviously we'll take id as an input and type will put it as a string, but eventually what we're going to get, we're going to get a book model, but this time not an array but only the book model. And also you can put it undefined also, because if I put an invalid id, I'll not get any correct book. So that's why undefined as the return type. This is called a type union. So, but how to get that? We'll return this dot book dot find. Let's use the arrow function and we'll do this book. You see the different type completion or different properties are automatically coming, the development experience for the developer. So this is what another feature that we can use in TypeScript. So now I can use id. So this id equal to the given id. So where this id matches, only that information I want to get it back. So that's what the get book by id. So this new function called add new book, I'll type its input as generic. That's the TypeScript generic I'm using. And here I'll tell that this data, whatever the payload comes as a request input, that will also will be type as T. And add book, I want to return this book model, or it can be null also. So book model and null, I'll explain why. But when I'm sending the input type definition as T as a generic, I want to make it more aligned. I'll say extends this new book, right? So whenever I'll enter the request, it should have a new book kind of a, it should have all the new books, because I'm not passing the ID as an input. This I am expecting ID to be generated by the backend. But so I want to ensure that when I make a request payload, it will contain this minimum 3 properties. Okay. And the return type is again only the book model type, and or it can be nothing, because that if the book is already exists in the database or some, though I'm not using any database here, but in case I'll put a validation like if the book is already existing in this array, then I'll not allow. So in that case, I'm just returning null. So let's create a variable called book, and that I want to construct as ID. Let's say this is generate a new function that we're going to create, and also let's use a spread operator. Whatever the data comes, that's our book actually. So it is a spread operator, and we just put it into this book. So book is nothing but contains ID any plus the data type that you are passing, which is a type of new books. So this is all automatically coming as a part of. Okay, fantastic. So once the book is created, so obviously the next option should be in this book array, we can just push this particular book. But before that, we want to put a validation. For that, let's create a private function called check if already exist as a function, and I will validate based on title of the book, and it will return a boolean, like whether yes or no kind of a signal it will give. For that, I'll check this book dot use a sum function, and I will use this book dot title exactly matches with the input title. But before that, let's make it one more validation, like to string or to lowercase, I would say to lowercase, so that any capital or small title I'm giving, it will still be able to validate to lowercase, and I'm just validating whether it's a boolean or not by returning to this. So that way it is able to validate if the title does already exist in the array, then it will return kind of a true, otherwise false. So what we'll do, we'll validate if not, this particular function will call and passing this book dot title, and if this is a valid, then if the validation fails, means that book doesn't exist anymore, then we can append to this. Otherwise, we will just return null. At the end, we'll return the book. That's all. So this book we are actually returning out of. So that way, this validation successful. Only pending activities is generate ID. So let's create this function as well. Okay, it's also private, called generate ID, and it will return a string type ID. Okay, for that we'll use something, a map random function to string. Let's say character take 36 followed by substring will take 2 to 9 as a start and end. So this is what we're going to send as an output, called generate ID will return something, a dynamic ID value that fits to this the ID of the book. That way this add book part is over. Let's do one more thing called public but delete book. So delete book also will take ID as an input, and it will return, let's say boolean, yes and no, whether the deletion is successful or not. So we'll take some let's say initial length of the array, correct? So this is the initial length of the array that particular this book contains. Put length, and now we will do this dot book. We'll use the filter command, filter function, and that time we'll use this arrow function. We'll say like this book dot ID not equal to the given ID. Okay, so that way that particular books array will be filtered only which are available after this filtration. So let's recalculate the length and return that validation. So I'm just going to check if this dot book dot length. So obviously after deletion from this array, the length will be getting reduced. So expecting it should be my initial length, it will be lower than the initial length count. So that way the return type boolean it will validate out of. So that way my deletion book method is also done. Let's save it. So let's create our API response file. So for that we'll start with a class, and we'll also export this class, and the name is API response. And I'm going to take it as a input, as a generic type class. So what type of request data type will come, I don't know at this time. So I'm taking it as a generic type that I'm going to accept. Now let's create our constructor having 3 input, as success is one of the boolean, going by the data, which it takes the input data type generic as t, also set the default value as null, and finally set the property called error and takes input as string, and default value also set to null for that error. That is the third parameter for our constructor. And this is how our constructor looks like with the different parameters as an input. So next create a static type method called success, which will take the data type as t as an input, and it will return the same class type instance as an output response. Similar way, create another static method called error to handle the different error scenarios, which will take the input as a string, and the output can be either the same string or it can also be a null. So your output annotations has to be set as per. So here it's complaining, it's saying that it's not assignable to a null type, is not assignable to a t. So we have to put something here as null. Okay, that way this validation will not complain. Let's now get into our controller area. Okay, because this controller will be using both service and API response. We have just completed this API response class. So let's call this hook controller. It is more of the express layer, so we'll be using express here. So I'll be taking request and response from express. By the way, I haven't yet installed express, so let's install it. npm install express. So once I install it, it will create a node modules in my node in my project. Looks like this npm install is done, my express is added, but still it's saying that it doesn't have a type definition. Okay, so it's not able to understand what is this request and response. It is not able to get it back, but it's giving one interesting thing. It's saying that we have to install this type definition by following this command. So copy it and run here. What will happen in the node modules, if you see, there will be @types will be created after the installation is done, as you can see, and here you will find the express type definition, and now this no more complaints. Let's import a few more. One is from book service. So we'll get the service called book service, and from the book service, what are the things we want? Obviously we want the book service class instance. Next we'll also use this API, right? Just now we have created utils API response. What will collect? API response. Once 3 are done, let's create a constant called book service, and that is actually new book service. Okay, so using that we are creating a book service class. So I'm using get all books as a function expression, which is taking an arrow function, taking to request and response of my express API app. So now what we'll do here, we can just simply call this dot, rather I will say this book service. We have this get all book. So this function you can call, and it will return what? Return the array, book model array. So let's create a constant called book, which is an array, and that we can pass it as a response. So response dot JSON, we can call this API response dot success, and we can pass this book. That's all. So that way the API response will be formatting our all the book details. So let's export it so that we can call it from the router. Another one, let's say we want to create call get book by ID. Again, we can put request as and response as an arrow function. And now what we want, get book by ID. So obviously in the request parameter, we'll have the ID values that I want to pass it. Again, you just call book service dot get book by ID, and it takes one input, and input is the ID string. So you can put it as request dot params dot ID. So once I pass it, what it's going to get is going to get the book model or undefined. So let's constant book, and here we can say like if book is not is the defined one, then we can say response dot JSON API response dot success. How fantastically the code completion works, right? So that is the easy way to design it, and we can put this book. So now the last time this book was an array, but this time this book is a simple object, not an array. Okay, so that's how the API response, we took it as a generic type. As you can see, I have put this T as a generic type. It can be array, it can be a normal object. All right, so now otherwise we can simply say that response dot status. Finally, we'll create the delete book, and here again we have to delete from the delete book using the delete book function. It needs the ID, so request dot params dot ID, and what it will return, it will return a boolean. So if we have this true, means success, otherwise is a failure. So we can say request response dot JSON API response. So it is not returning any data. We can put dot success, and we can pass as null, and else simply we can put response dot status as 404 dot JSON API response dot error, and here we can put book not found, or book deletion failed, whatever. So this enter controller is all created. So finally we'll be just need the router and the app development. Router is also an express level component, so we'll use import express from express, and also we'll be importing this controller, right? Book controller, and what we can extract out of, we can extract get all books, delete book, get book by ID. All right, so all these trees we are just importing out of this book controller. Now create a constant called router and use this express dot router. Okay, once the router is getting created, we can use this router called get, and we can say simple one API called books endpoint, and that time we can say get all books. So whenever someone tries with the API called books, and then it will trigger this get all books method of the book service API. Similarly, router dot get, but if I just try something like slash books, but this time colon ID, it will be more of a get book by ID, right? the final router dot post. This time I want to post the new book. So I'll again use this in point, but that time I'll be using add. I think add book is not available. That means we haven't export this add book. Oh, we haven't created, we didn't create the add book feature. So let's create the function called add book. It's simple, book service dot add book, and here we'll pass this request dot body. So that add book will actually return the book model, or it will return nothing. So accordingly, let's take the book, a new book rather, and this new book we can pass it. If new book is there, the valid, then we can simply say response.json API response dot success, pass this new book. If it fails, that means some book is already there. That's why I'm getting a null, right? It can return null also. So this null we have to handle. You can simply say response dot status. You can put 409, means resource already exists, dot JSON API response dot error, and now you can put simply book already exists. Okay, so with an exclamation. So that way my add book is also available now in this book service. So in the router we can now get add book as well. So here we can now use add book when we are making a post call. Finally, router dot delete, and we can say again books followed by some ID, then we'll just use the delete book. So my router is all set. Router is created successfully. So we have reached all the way till here. Now we are just going to end our final step called Express App Development, and then we are ready to test our beautiful, awesome book service API. But we built all the way using a TypeScript. So let's complete the remaining stuff. Going to index.ts to create our final app. Here as well, we need import Express. Let's constant port we want to use as process.environment port, or maybe something available, otherwise use 3000 as a default port. Finally, create the app called Express, and here we definitely need to import one more thing, that is our router. So from, by the way, in the router we possibly didn't export our router, right? So what we can do, we can simply say export default router. Okay, so now if I go to index.ts, we can say simple like router, and what is that router called? Book router. So this book routers we can simply put over here, okay, because we are just putting a default export, so we can use this file name book routers. All right, so finally we'll use app dot we'll use some middleware. Let's use the middleware called express.json to parse the request payload. Finally, app.use, and we'll use something called the router, correct? So that is if I get something called API, then it will definitely go to book routers. Okay, so these two middlewares will be helping, to get to the router. Finally, app.listen, and here we can say this port, and finally we can do our console log, and we can simply say that listening to port with a text literal called port, right? So that's all our TypeScript completion. But now we cannot test it until we compile it to a JavaScript. So for that, in the tsconfig, we put our out directory as dist. So to make our JavaScript compile JavaScript, rather, we'll run the command in the root of this project called tsc. And what will happen? It will compile all the TypeScript things, and it will create a distribution folder, and that it contains all the files, but in JavaScript compiled version of our code. Excellent, right? And to run this application, we go to package.json. We'll run a start script, and here we'll do a little change. We'll say node and distribution index, because we'll run actually the index of this distribution file, not the source file. Okay, so let's save this. Do I have anything to save pending? No save, right? All set are done. We can simply say npm run start, and what will happen? Voila, its application is up and running, and it's listening in port 3000. So we'll use our Postman to test it. So let's use our Postman, and I'm using this localhost 3000 followed by API and followed by books. So this is what will go to the get all books function. So this is, if I just send, it says everything empty. So this is our API response formatting. Okay, the success, data, and error. That is how the API response utility is behaving. Let's add a new book by calling this books API endpoint. Go to body, click on raw, and here we can add our property ID. We are not going to pass anything, it will be generated. So let's start with title, and we can put something called DevOps for SAP. I think this is a book, a popular book written by Raja Gupta. So we can put author as Raja Gupta. I think it's published, or rather year. Year was all the way. In number, it should be 2023. I think that is what it should be, the year. So if I pass this as a post call to this API, I'm supposed to create, voila, it's generated successfully. This is the data. ID is also get generated using a runtime function, and it's actually added to the array, runtime array of this book service API. So you can validate, go to our this books API, get all books. If I run, yeah, we are able to see the same input, same book details. So let's create one more with the same name. Okay, if we try to post it, it will validate success false, no data, and if error is book already exists, the validation is actually working. So let's do one thing. We try once again with the book by ID. So for that, we'll go to here, change it in the URL ID values as this, click on send, and voila, we are able to use this book by ID feature. It's working fine. Change it, get to delete this particular book and send. Yeah, the book is already deleted. We can validate once again from this get all books, and really it doesn't have any content in the runtime array structure. So our API is up and running, all working fine, all the endpoints are working perfectly. Hope you understood something interesting today about the TypeScript capabilities, and more you are going to expect in the new uploads. I'll keep uploading various aspects of TypeScript capabilities in future videos, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching and subscribe my channel. See you soon.